Hello everyone and welcome back to our course. In this section, we are going to be able to kill the enemies by shooting at them. So join me back in our C++ solution. We are going to enter our enemy controller C++ file. Here we're going to go into our onOverlap function. This is the function that tests if an enemy overlaps with something else. For example, we already have a check if the enemy overlaps with the player. If any enemy does, then we will pause the game. Let's add here an else if statement, which is only going to run if the if statement above it does not run. So only if this condition passes as here false, then we can check another condition. And if that passes as true, then we can run its body. So here, let's add a condition to check if our enemy overlaps with a projectile. A projectile is also known as a bullet, which the player can shoot at different objects. So how do we check if we have collided with a projectile? Well, we can grab the other actor, which refers to what our enemy collided or overlapped with. Then we can get its name, and we can check if that name contains the text projectile. Because if so, then that means that the enemy has collided with a projectile. There are many other ways that you could also find projectiles. This is just one way, by the name of the actor. All right, and if indeed our if statement here, our condition passes as true, let's write the if statement's body. What I want to do is I want to destroy the enemy and the projectile. So first, let's destroy the enemy. For that, we're going to grab this, which refers to this instance of the enemy controller class. It refers to whatever enemy collided with the projectile. Because we don't want to delete all the enemies, just whichever one was in the overlap. I'm going to then call the function destroy, which is just going to remove that object from my game. As well, I'm going to destroy my other actor, which is my projectile. So I'm going to call other actor and call destroy on that as well, because we don't want the projectile to be able to kill two objects. You could enable that, but in this case we're not. We're just destroying the projectile if it hits an enemy. All right, and remember, this body is only going to be executed if the corresponding if statement passes as true, but also because this is an else if statement, the condition will only be tested if the previous if statement ran its condition as false, if this condition passed as false. You could remove this else statement and just have two if statements. These are now independent, so both of the conditions will be checked. But I'm going to use else instead, because if this first condition passes as true, it means our enemy collided with a player. And therefore, I want to stop all checking for if they collide with anything else. All right, and we can already test this out. Okay, we can check to see if our code executes. Likely with collisions, you often have to change your collision presets as well. So we'll look into that. Let's hit debug for now and see the results that we get. All right, here is my editor, and I can press play. And notice that currently when I shoot at the enemies, my projectiles just bounce off. So we have to change the collision presets if we want our collision and on overlap function to actually work. Let's hit escape, and also let's stop our debugging solution, and let's relaunch our Unreal project without the debugging mode. With collision processing, you have to be careful about your collision presets. So I'm going to go through all of the collision presets that are involved. Here I am back in Unreal, no longer in debugging mode. I've also zoomed in a bit so that way you can see a bit better. And let's pop open the enemy blueprint. You can see there are 3 parts to the enemy blueprint in the components window. There's the enemy itself, the root box, and then a cube. Let's start with our component of just the blueprint itself. And inside of the details window, we're interested in the collision category here. Okay, we have generate overlap events during level streaming, update overlaps method during level streaming, and default update overlaps method during level streaming. Okay, here I just have generate overlap events during level streaming on. Next, let's go into the root box component. And again, we want to go to the details window and find collision. Here for our root box, we want to have simulation generates hit events off. We want generate overlap events to be on. And then we want our collision presets to be overlap all dynamic. Okay, that way we're overlapping with everything, but we're blocking the projectile. This may seem counterintuitive. Why are we blocking the projectile? Well, because we want the on overlap to be handled by our custom C++ code. So that's why we're blocking just the projectile collision. But we're overlapping with everything else that is a dynamic actor. Okay, next, let's go into the cube, the last component of the enemy, and again find collision. Here for this cube, we want to have simulation generates hit events off. So hit events won't fire when this object collides during physics simulation. We want to have generate overlap events to be on and collision presets to be no collision, because our C++ code is what's handling the collision. Now let's go back into our map and let's also check the collision presets for the projectile, because there are 2 objects involved in our overlap, specifically for killing. There's the enemy and there's the projectile. So open up your first-person projectile blueprint. This was created with the first-person shooter template. In the components here, we actually have 4 components: our self, just the blueprints, our collision component for handling collisions, a static mesh, which is the visual of the bullet there, and projectile movement, which is for shooting this across the world. Let's start with self. Okay, so I've selected the projectile itself, and let's go to the details window and the collision category here. And here we just have the default collision presets, part of the template. Next, let's go into our collision component, which handles collisions, and go into the details window and find that collision category. Here, for our collision component, we want to make sure we have simulation generates hit events off. We don't need that. We can have generate overlap events on, and collision presets are going to be overlap all. Then for our static mesh, which is the visual, let's go into its collision component. We're going to have simulation generates hit events off. We want to generate overlap events, and collision presets to be no collision. All right, and finally, we do have that component, the projectile movement, but that has nothing to do with collisions. That's just for the physics of shooting that across. Okay, so now if we save and compile these two edited blueprints, let's go back into our viewport and let's press play. Okay, and now if I shoot at my enemy, it will disappear. Awesome. So that means our C++ code is now working. My enemies are being spawned and the code for killing an enemy is working. Awesome. Okay, so that is how we can enable our collisions to work. Join me coming up in our next lecture. We are going to build out our score system. So we're going to allow our player's score to increase. I will see you in that next section.